Our world is changing. Every day, it changes a little faster. Some changes are too small to see. Others, too big to handle. Sometimes, change feels slow. So slow, we don't even notice. Other times, it happens all at once, and we can't keep up. For our climate, change means many things. And between too small to see and too big to handle, there is a whole world of difference. The clock is ticking. This is Bloomberg Green.
The policies to protect people and the environment. This week, Europe prepares to put $500 billion to work as leaders make new climate pledges at France's One Planet Summit. And we speak with one of the architects of the Green New Deal, why taking action on climate change is about more than just protecting the environment. Plus, the planet has lost 2/3 of animal life in the last 50 years. Conservation International tells us why biodiversity is so crucial to human prosperity. From Bloomberg's headquarters in New York, I'm Kaylee Lyons, and this is Bloomberg Green. The European Union is making green the buzzword of 2021. Under the bloc's massive economic recovery program, more than 500 billion euros will go to cleaning up its energy, industry, transport, and farming sectors. The EU's very own Green Deal, a central pillar of the recovery plan, will be turned into legislation, setting it on course to become the world's first climate-neutral continent. Let's take a closer look at what's in store for the coming months with our reporter in London, Jess Schenkelman. Jess, what are the first steps?
Well, Kaylee, just to put this in context, you've got to remember the European Union is the third largest emitter after the US and China. So it's a massive commitment to try and become the first carbon neutral continent. The European Union's legislative processes are notoriously slow and prolonged. And so we're at a stage now where they have agreed a target for 55% carbon reductions by 2040 compared to 1990, but they have to put that into law, and that's what we're going to see happen at the beginning of the year. And that's kind of like an overarching framework. And then they're going to start to get into the nitty-gritty of some of the sector-specific targets and measures that they want to introduce. We're going to see legislation proposed by the EU Commission on things like renewable energy, car standards, shipping, and that's going to start to come out throughout the course of this year.
And Jess, the EU is also planning to add a carbon levy on certain imports. How does that change the playing field?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating idea, and it's been around for a very long time. So the idea is to try and tackle this problem of carbon leakage, which is that if you have one country that has really tight pollution rules, what you might end up having happen is that the steel companies and the cement companies, the big emitters, just move to another country that doesn't have pollution rules, and then the carbon is still emitted into the global atmosphere, and that country with the pollution rules ends up losing out on economic benefits, and they're less competitive. So the idea here is they have a carbon border tax, which means that if you're importing products from a country that has less stringent pollution rules, they face a levy. And the idea there is to protect the competitiveness of EU companies, but also to try and bring other countries up to same standards.
Right, so that's basically the EU forcing everybody to play along, right?
Absolutely.
All right, Jess Schenkelman of Bloomberg News, thank you so much. Cutting carbon emissions is a global effort. The EU's plan covers a population of about 445 million people, but one of the key players is India, which has almost 1 billion more people. Our Green reporter Akshat Rati takes a closer look at the subcontinent.
In the last 18 months, 7 of the 10 largest economies in the world have set goals to zero out emissions within decades. In order, that's China, Japan, Germany, UK, France, Italy, and Canada. With Joe Biden as president, you can expect the US to join the roster soon. That makes it 8. That leaves out India and Brazil. Let's keep Brazil for another day. Will India, which relies heavily on domestic coal and imported oil, be forced to set a net zero goal? Experts say that rich countries setting net zero goals is not reason enough for India to do so. The country's 1.3 billion people have a tiny carbon footprint. Only 2 tons per Indian citizen compared to 16 tons for each US resident. But more importantly, India's historical contribution to global carbon emissions is also small. Only 1/8 that of the US and 1/4 that of China. The country will need and cannot be denied the use of fossil fuels to pull millions more out of poverty. But India's pushback should not be simply to say no. India is one of the most vulnerable when it comes to impacts of climate change. That means it is in India's self-interest to ensure that catastrophic global warming is avoided. Fortunately, there are sectors of the Indian economy where you can cut emissions and save money. Solar power in India, for example, is among the cheapest anywhere in the world. Transitioning to electric buses, rickshaws, cars, and motorcycles will make the country's air cleaner and shrink its oil imports. India is also a shining example of rolling out energy-efficient measures and technologies. The country deployed LED lighting at such a pace that it is now saving its citizens billions of dollars each year. These success stories show India's real capabilities. What it now needs from the world is investment in cleaner technologies, which it can then scale up when cheap enough. So India may not be ready yet to set a net zero goal, but it isn't giving up on climate action either.
Coming up, economics. We speak to the authors of the Green New Deal, Rhiana Gunn-Wright, on how climate policy can support the economy and society. This is Bloomberg Green. From Bloomberg's headquarters in New York, I'm Kaylee Lines. Now let's get your green brief. Here's Jennifer Zabazaja.
Here's the climate news you need to know this week. The equivalent of 24 million cars driven for a year. That's the impact of 2020's wildfire season on California's environment. According to the state's Clean Air Agency, the nearly 10,000 fires spewed 112 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, thwarting the state's fight against climate change. 2020 was the second warmest year on record, coming within 1/100th of a degree of tying the high set by 2016. And German reinsurer Munich Re says the climate disasters it wrought cost the world $210 billion, and further warming will bring even more perils. Global atmospheric carbon levels are set to hit an unwelcome milestone. This year, they'll be 50% higher than before the start of the Industrial Revolution. It took more than 200 years for the concentration to rise 25%. The other 25% happened in just the last 3 decades. But it's not all doom and gloom. One of the world's most famous streets is getting a green makeover. Paris is spending 250 million euros on transforming the Champs-Élysées, French for Elysian Fields, into a garden. It wants to halve the number of cars on the road and instead have a mile-long stretch of green spaces. I'm Jennifer Zabazaja in New York. Back to you.
Rhiana Gunn-Wright wants to change how we see the warming world. Her work shows that environmental issues aren't abstract concepts. They are connected to everyday problems that impact people's lives, from housing to COVID-19. A co-author of the Green New Deal and now director of climate policy at the Roosevelt Institute, Gunn-Wright spoke to Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern about what elements of the Green New Deal might be implemented under President-elect Joe Biden.
A lot of it can happen through President-elect Joe Biden. In particular, a lot of Build Back Better, that the plan around investments and using climate as an anchor for those investments, that's very much out of the Green New Deal. And if you notice, before the Green New Deal, the conversation was really about carbon taxes. The conversation was about market mechanisms. And now we're really talking about public investment. The Biden administration has also committed to directing 40% of investments to frontline communities, communities of color, communities in fossil fuel dependent places, right? And that is all very Green New Deal.
We know that President-elect Biden wants to bring America back into the Paris Climate Agreement. What does he do after joining?
Over and over, I think President-elect Biden, as well as other members of his newly named administration, have talked about the importance of this being a global fight, the US needing to join, and in lots of ways to lead, because we are responsible for so many of the emissions. We've kind of overshot a lot of the Paris Agreement already. We know that there's a need for more aggressive commitments, and many nations have already made more aggressive commitments.
Yeah, we had seen some very serious, ambitious plans: China, South Korea, the UK, the European Union. How do you hold these governments accountable? How do you think the world needs to hold these governments accountable?
Politicians respond to public pressure and public will. And so the way to hold governments accountable is to support these movements and continuing to vote on climate. And we have to also punish, again, through votes or actions, leaders who are not in line with climate goals. We have to both support those who are moving forward and sanction those who aren't.
You take a much bigger scale and scope of the climate problem, and you link it to social justice. From all of your research, where do you find this link the most prevalent in our society?
It's important to recognize that fossil fuel companies have really used, in particular, racial oppression to uphold their industries, right? So in the US, for instance, most fossil fuel facilities are sited in low-income communities of color. Those communities are bearing the brunt of that pollution. That has two effects. One, of course, those communities get sick at disproportionate rates. But the second consequence of that is, because of histories of racial oppression and class oppression, those folks aren't believed. It's really close to me because when I figured out I lived in a frontline community, it was like last year. And to figure out that I had asthma, which my family thought was a childhood disease because so many people had it, and to figure out that someone was essentially poisoning me for money. And we saw that in the US. When COVID hit, frontline communities where there's the most fossil fuel pollution, they were dying and being hospitalized at far higher rates than everyone else. If the pollution wasn't there, if they were listened to, et cetera, it definitely wouldn't be as bad. And so that's what I mean when all of it is connected.
What do you say to people who push back on some climate change initiatives because they're worried about job losses and they're worried about economic growth, especially coming out of a recession? How do you convince them and ensure governments that there are economic benefits to transitioning?
Now, I don't have to convince them. The data does. We know that fossil fuel companies are losing money rapidly, right? They're at the bottom of the S&P continually. They're also shedding workers, right? There are layoffs and there's more layoffs coming. And conversely, with clean energy, it's more labor intensive. So it creates more jobs than any investments in fossil fuels. We know that those jobs are across the wage spectrum. They have more opportunities for families sustaining wages. And we also know that clean energy, those sort of investments in new industries, can spark ongoing innovation that pushes growth forward. As you're transitioning, there will be some jobs lost in the short term, but on the whole, you're going to gain millions of jobs. And there's been so many analyses of Green New Deal-esque proposals that show you gaining 5 million, 10 million, 15 million jobs, right? Which is the fossil fuel industry isn't creating.
And you've become almost like a role model for the youth. Is the youth really key in terms of moving the agenda forward? I mean, what kind of role do you see them playing in the dialogue?
They're incredibly important. First of all, if you're talking about the climate movement has been around for a long time, but with any movement, there's a need for fresh blood. Someone needs to come in to move this forward, and the youth are doing that. And particularly if you're talking about folks who are willing to try to hold people accountable aggressively, youth groups have proven themselves, Sunrise in particular, willing to do that over and over and over. That's part of successful protests. That's part of successful movements. Protests and activists are supposed to make us uncomfortable in order to move us forward. I've heard multiple times from representatives, senators, that my grandchildren keep talking to me about climate change. They're joining Sunrise. This seems like a really big deal. And now they're looking anew at climate change and thinking about it anew. That makes waves.
That was Rhiana Gunn-Wright, co-author of the Green New Deal, speaking with our own Anne-Marie Hordern. And coming up, the link between biodiversity and the economy. The world has lost more than 2/3 of its animals in the last 50 years. We investigate why it's so important to prevent ecological collapse. This is Bloomberg Green.
"2021 is a crucial year for the planet.
We are destroying species and habitat at an absolutely unconscionable rate.
Temperatures are reaching record highs, biodiversity is collapsing, deserts are spreading, fire, floods, and hurricanes are more frequent and extreme, and we are extremely fragile."
When sea levels rise, when droughts become the norm and not the exception, this has catastrophic effects on natural habitats.
Through this crucial year, we should and will step up our efforts. We owe it to ourselves and especially to the younger generations.
We should reduce or redirect subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity. We need to initiate private-public partnerships on a far wider scale.
As an international community, we have a responsibility to act.
We will invest several hundred million euros over the next 4 years for research on biodiversity, animal health, emerging diseases, and much more.
What we want to do is to take collective action. We can move the dial if we decide to do so.
In New York, I'm Kaylee Lyons. This is Bloomberg Green. Well, world leaders are shining the spotlight on biodiversity and pledging further climate action at France's One Planet Summit. But why has this issue risen to the forefront? We broke down some of the key statistics.
Animals across the globe are dying by alarming rates. A report by World Wildlife Fund and the Zoological Society of London found that populations of mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fish fell by 68% in the last 50 years. In the tropical Americas, the rate was worse, with a 94% decline in the same period. And the size of observed wildlife populations in or near freshwater globally have fallen by 84%. Continued human abuse of the planet may lead to the collapse of the systems and resources that allow global civilization to persist in the first place. Overfishing and hunting, invasive species, pollution, habitat loss, and climate change are the main causes of this animal population crash. The report compiles evidence from 4,392 different vertebrate species and concludes the evidence for humanity's destruction of biodiversity is unequivocal. Using powerful computer models to simulate policy that stops biodiversity loss, scientists have explored scenarios to slow the trend. Such measures would include expanded conservation, increasing agricultural yields while also eliminating food waste, and cutting the global meat intake in half. By changing what the world eats and how it produces that food, nations could stop this tragic loss of life by almost 50%.
Joining me now to explain why biodiversity is so important and all the ways it touches human life is Lee Hanna. He is a senior scientist at Conservation International, where he leads the response to climate change. Lee, can we start just from the very basics? What are the primary drivers of biodiversity loss?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And as we know, biodiversity is really the scientific term for nature. And we know it's important to take care of the planet and take care of nature. So all the sorts of drivers that are impacting nature that we know about, deforestation, pollution, all of those things are impacting biodiversity. And as scientists, then we measure that decline in diversity, which is the important thing, because as we know, if we have a world of crows and rats and cockroaches, it's not the same world as having a world that's full of all of nature, and that's what we're trying to get at with biodiversity.
Why is it problematic if we had a world of just rats and cockroaches? I mean, how crucial is it to have diversity of species in terms of the way everyday people live their lives?
Well, tremendously important. And as we're seeing right now, in the grips of this pandemic, one of the services that nature provides is when we take care of nature, then these sorts of diseases stay within nature and don't hop over into people. The reason we're facing increasing numbers of pandemics is because we haven't taken care of nature well. We're getting more species that do well around people, like rats and cockroaches, and those species can transfer diseases to people.
So there's a link between biodiversity and disease. There's also a link between biodiversity and climate change, right?
Absolutely, and those same sorts of drivers that are impacting biodiversity are taking down tropical forests and reducing the amount of carbon in those forests, which means more CO2 in the atmosphere, more global warming. And if we can reverse that trend and even begin to rebuild forests, then we can actually take some CO2 out of the atmosphere, which in addition to our own actions to reduce CO2 emissions is critically important.
Why should business leaders care about? What is the relationship between big business and biodiversity? Most
importantly, to a lot of the consumers involved, recreation is incredibly important. So from Central Park in New York to the Grand Canyon to all our other local and national and state beaches and parks, those are really important areas for people to get out and get into nature. And the research shows that, just an hour-long walk in an urban green space reduces stress levels measurably. So we know it's really important. We know people love to do it. So tourism's important as well. And then in tropical countries, we may have services like water provision, protection from storm surge, and so on, that are provided by mangroves and forests that are super important as well. So just the health of the planet is one reason that business leaders should be concerned. And I think business is sold on that. We see that businesses are increasingly concerned about the environment, and many corporations are taking steps to get deforestation out of their supply chains, which is a critical step for climate change, for disease control, and for taking care of the planet.
What other tools could business use if they want to help?
Well, I think educating consumers, consumers that make educated choices are really important. Businesses that just build consideration of biodiversity and nature into their considerations of supply chain and their day-to-day operations are critical, because then consumers don't have to sit and read a label in a store. They can just be confident that if they're dealing with this corporation, they know that environmental responsibility is part of the package.
Is there a reason for hope? Are we making sufficient progress?
Well, yeah, I think there is reason for hope, and we're not making sufficient progress yet, but if we can hit this 30% of the planet being natural target, then that's a really major step over the next couple of decades in getting towards a planet that is healthy. I think we want to do better than that, but that's the immediate goal, and we need to have that ambition. And so corporations supporting that international goal is important, and then corporations taking responsible roles in how they source agricultural products and timber products are really important in making sure we can meet that goal.
Thanks to Rhiana of Conservation International. That's it for this week, but keep the conversation going. Follow us on Twitter @Climate. I'm Kaylee Lines. This is Bloomberg Green.